This is a summary of Part 3 of David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. At the end of Part 2, Cleanthes was telling Philo that if you accept Copernicus's view that his analogy between the Earth and the planets, then you should also accept his analogy. Now, Philo responds that the difference is Copernicus's analogy was much more down to earth. And so now at the beginning of Part 3, Cleanthes is able to reply to Philo. He says that, in fact, during Copernicus's time, Copernicus was subject to some of the same criticisms that he's getting from Philo. That is that there's a big disanalogy between this world and the planets out there. He says that we should learn from the past. He said Philo should learn from the past because now we accept Copernicus's theory, and so he thinks Philo should also accept this analogy that he's drawing now as being even stronger than Copernicus's analogy. That is the analogy between objects in nature and human artifacts. So for the rest of this section, Cleanthes is going to respond to Philo's arguments in Part 2. And so for Cleanthes is going to use some illustrations here. The first illustration is the voice in the clouds. He says, quote, "Suppose that an articulate voice were heard in the clouds, much louder and more melodious than any which human art could ever reach. Suppose that this voice were extended in the same instant over all nations and spoke to each nation in its own language and dialect. Suppose that the words delivered not only contain a just sense and meaning, but convey some instruction altogether worthy of a benevolent being, superior to mankind. Could you possibly hesitate a moment concerning the cause of this voice?" So his point is that even though we don't have this experience of voices speaking from the heavens, if one were to ever do that, we would be justified in believing that the cause of this voice is similar to the cause of other voices we've heard in our lifetime. And that would be a mind. Now, because this voice is so much bigger and greater than any voice we've ever heard, we would be right in concluding that the mind is also bigger and greater than any mind we've ever known. The second case, or the second illustration, is called a living library. And this is quite a creative illustration, so you have to use your imagination to follow along with this. But imagine we don't get our books from the normal in the normal way from authors. Imagine that we grow them in our gardens. And when we want a new book, we go out into the garden and harvest these books. We take them inside and we read the great stories and we learn the philosophies. And he says that if this were the way it happened, we would be justified in believing that even though there was an organic process involved, that the ultimate cause of these books would have to be a mind of some kind. And he puts this dilemma to Philo, saying this, quote, "Assert either that a rational volume is no proof of a rational cause, or admit of a similar cause to all the works of nature." So he's trying to trap Philo here, to get him to admit that you'd have to say in this fantastic case that books are, that the cause of these books is some kind of mind. But if you were to do that, then you'd have to also say, because of analogy, that the objects in nature that we see out in nature, these natural organisms, are also products of mind. At this point, he discusses a few more cases. He talks about the human eye and how when you study the human eye, it's just pressed upon you the conclusion that this must have been created or designed. He also just talks about the male and female of each species. He says that if you consider how they complement each other so well in nature, that it's just pressed upon you that this must have been something designed. At this point, he says, he makes a comment about how people don't accept these religious arguments. There are two types of people, he says. One is the ignorant savage who just has no curiosity about these things, and that's why they don't accept it. He says that Philo is not like these ignorant people. Philo is very smart, he's very intelligent, and he's very logical. In fact, he says Philo is too smart and is maybe overthinking these things. At this point, Pamphilus jumps in and comments on how Philo appears to be, quote, embarrassed and confounded. And it's not clear if he's embarrassed because of the compliment he's just been paid, or whether he is embarrassed and confounded because of the creative illustrations that he's just heard. But whatever, at this point, Demea takes the opportunity to jump in and continue to discuss the disanalogy or the dissimilarity between God and us. Demea says that when he reads a book, he's able to put himself in the mind of the author of the book. But when it comes to God, God's nature and being is so much farther beyond us and so different from us that he's unable to do so, that our words fail us here, that our thoughts are so dissimilar and so changing and subject to change and mistake than God's thoughts, that we really can't say anything at all about God. So there's a disanalogy for Demea. He's taking the side of Philo here. There's a disanalogy between us and God. I hope that was helpful.